Haphazard information is the first general pattern of the 6 patterns. And it's supported by the notion of who you know is how you go. So if you're a family or an individual who is surrounded by people who know a lot about individualized funding, and if your contacts at CLBC know a lot about individualized funding and present it to you as an option to consider, if your teachers in high school, if your MCFD social workers know about individualized funding, then and offer you that information, the likelihood is much higher that you'll choose it. What we know from CLBC staff, what we know from the other people sort of within the system that we talked about, is what they say is, I can't help families to understand and to know about individualized funding if I don't know myself. The other thing that families say about this haphazard information to sort of link sub-patterns is, if I'd have known about it, I might have chosen it, right? So some families just didn't even know that it was out there. And the other one is if they didn't know that it was out there, why haven't they heard about it before? There's mythology that's developed around IF. And so it isn't just that people don't know about it. It isn't just that people being family staff, self-advocates, service providers. It's not just that there's a lack of information. There's a pretty large degree of misinformation. In some parts of some regions in the province, there is a much higher uptake on individualized funding than there is in others. And for some families, and families who were geographically isolated, where there weren't service providers available, individualized funding was really the only option. So even where there were higher levels of uptake of individualized funding, it wasn't necessarily because people were informed and they were making conscious decisions. It was, this take it or leave it. This is really all there can be. Even in recognition that individualized funding has the potential to create more autonomy, more people live more self-determined lives, all those sorts of things, there was still a fear of becoming disconnected to the community living sector. The people that we reflected with who were using individualized funding, all, and this is primarily the direct individualized funding, they all acknowledged that there was a steep learning curve, but once you got over the hump, it was much better. But it took dedication to work yourself through that far. On a broader level, one of the sub-patterns around IF is complicated. People pondered whether or not IF in this incarnation of it now, whether it was ever really even built to fly in the first place. They recognized the early and constant, really, disruptive potential of individualized funding, and disruptive, I think, in a positive sense, but also in a disturbing sense, that in a lot of ways, just while the community living field sector was being built, with agencies becoming larger, agencies becoming more frequently unionized, accreditation, all these kind of accountability frameworks, trying to move in that direction at the same time as trying to move individualized funding forward. Basically the superstructure won out. While families believe theoretically and from a values perspective that individualized funding is the safest option, people not getting lost in a service delivery system, when their sons and daughters started to age, now that they're aging, families worry that people, and it's back to that potential for isolation. And so people are intentionally reconnecting with the service delivery field. And so there is practice that encourages people with individualized funding and even microboards as well to consider at certain times as part of their future planning to reconnect with the system. And so many families said, well, if I need to do that, why don't I just stay connected with the system? The other issue around risk versus safety is that the scarcity of resources that are out there, the fact that we're not in a prosperous time, there isn't a lot of money. There isn't a lot of money for individualized funding. So in this time where you had a choice between a day program, a spot in a day program, where you're going to be able to go, Monday through Friday, 9 to 3 sort of thing, or 20 hours a week of individualized funding, families will take what appears to be more service that meets their needs as a family, rather than take the risk of having these other services that you can be more creative with. From the host agency's perspective, there are a lot of rules and regulations that govern them and their work. They need to provide their services under certain guidelines, and in many cases, the agencies, the host agencies that the sector all look to and applaud for what we call creativity and their out-of-the-box, person-centered way to articulate this individualized funding. What they told us is, if we're those people, it's our willingness to break the rules. It's our willingness to be potentially offside with our regulatory bodies, because in order to really enact individualized funding through host agency with the flavor and the intent that it's supposed to be, and for families really to be driving the work, it's almost impossible for host agency to do that without significant alteration to their existing ways of being. Individualized funding, to begin with, was part of a structure at CLBC, a foundation at CLBC. Several of the other parts of that structure don't exist anymore, and or never really sort of were enacted to a robust degree. What we learned is that the amount of money that people would get and how they can use that money really influences their tolerance for how hard individualized funding is. There's just a question of, is it worth it, right? And for the amount of money that you get, there was a feeling that it wasn't worth it. The mirror side to that is that internally to CLBC, the amount of time, the amount of administrative attention that an individualized funding contract takes to set up and administer and to monitor and to manage takes the same amount of time as a global contract where 35, 40 people are served, right? And so from a systems perspective, IF isn't efficient. So as we move forward, we are very committed to take these patterns and try and flow our collaborative, user-focused research into a solution co-creation phase.